Started for the Raymore City Council work session for Monday, December the 4th. We have several items on our agenda tonight, 5 it looks like. And we'll go ahead and start with item A, the ordinance for hoarding. Mr. Feuerborn.
Thank you, sir, and I'm going to ask the chief to kick this item off.
And kick it off, I will. We're going to start with just a really short video just to sort of give you all a taste of hoarding. I guess that's probably not the proper terminology, but I know that I've told you all before that, you know, I'm kind of a fan of those shows that deal with hoarding and how communities are faced with those problems and how it usually falls to a codes officer to deal with hoarding. But we found just a really quick clip that we thought we would share with you all just to, you know, give you an idea of what hoarding is truly like when it has gotten out of control. David?
I readily admit that I have really...
Coming out of the walls, out of the mattresses, he sees them as his children.
People say, what would you ever want a rat for? Don't knock it till you try it.
Harder than we thought. They just keep multiplying and multiplying. They're not
dolls. If she didn't have with her own children, she substituted the dolls.
What else did? I could have started drinking. I could have done drugs.
This is one of those homes that you hear about. If someone falls, a huge pile falls on top of you. How awful would it be to die under a house?
A prime dumpster.
Who's throwing a stroller away? Who threw away a vacuum?
Found it in the garbage.
You look like a junk pile. I went through $112,000 in less than a year and a half.
He could snap.
Someone reported the house for the smell. It was that bad.
Here we go, Robin. You never know what's down in there, though.
I don't care.
I'm real fond of housework.
Worst hoard I've ever seen.
We even have to have a decontamination station for the first time ever.
You're probably going to just be pulled out of your house.
I don't give a damn. I don't want my entire life ripped out and put in a garbage bag. It's not garbage.
22,000. Well, there's probably 50,000 out there.
I knew y'all would appreciate it.
A lot of them are duplicates and triplicates.
I don't understand the beer cans. I don't know why he's interested in them. I know he has exhausted most of his money on these cans, and I've asked him to just sell them, but he's too attached to them. He won't let them go.
It's a reminder of the joy of the life that I've led.
So just to give you an idea, and I want to compliment Mr. Carteret because the ordinance and the wording of the ordinance, or the proposed ordinance rather, that you will see before you really focuses on the thing that we feel is the most important, and that's the safety aspect of individuals who get involved in hoarding behavior. As you could see, you know, just from some of these clips that they showed here, that many times portions of the house, water, restrooms, things like that, become inoperable. And there are piles of debris inside the residence that make it unsafe for the individual to live there, especially when there is no clear pathway through, there's no place for the individual to sleep. There's no, it's not an accumulation of, although in the case of the beer can hoarder, it's collections, but it is a collection to the nth degree, so much so that the individual has put themselves in danger and now is endangering the lives of the people who live around them because they attract, as you see, rats and insects and things like that, especially when the debris is filth in nature, or there's not running water, and there's food accumulations, and there are all kinds of hoards, as you could see from this clip. But mostly, the thing that I like about the proposed ordinance is that it is providing assistance to individuals who so desperately need it, because it's a mental health issue. I know we talked about that at the previous work session about having a partnership with those mental health professionals that are able to provide that aftercare to allow the individual to get the help that they need. But this ordinance addresses all of those things. So I know Mr. Carteret has all kinds of information, but I'm happy to answer any questions as well.
Thank you, Chief. So as you indicated, the topic was brought up back in August for council discussion when staff first presented the idea of amending our property maintenance code to include a section on hoarding. So what we've submitted in your packets this evening is a draft ordinance. What we're looking at is the section that would be dealing with hoarding. It's identified as 545-900. This would be an entirely new section of code. What you're seeing before you with the highlight and the cross out are simply the changes that we have done since the August 7th work session. So we're just trying to identify how did we modify the ordinance based upon your comments that were provided at the initial work session. So what we've done is under the definition dangerous accumulation, we've added some language, we've taken some sections out, trying to provide clarification to our definition. Because dangerous accumulation is really the basis for the entire hoarding ordinance. That terminology that we utilize is what triggers the different sections of the ordinance itself. If you have a dangerous accumulation on your property that meets the parameters of 545-910, which identifies unlawful accumulations, then we have a violation of the ordinance. So we try to provide some clarification, as I indicated, with the definition. When you get down to the unlawful accumulations, again, just eliminated some repetitive language there, but that is the items A through H of that section is the real meat of the ordinance itself. I mean, what we're dealing with when we talk about the proposed ordinance, it is new code language. We have existing code language that deals with the minor infractions of property maintenance, whether it's the home or the yard area, that deals with the isolated violations that we have, that we're able to, through our code enforcement, tackle on a day-to-day basis. We have a violation, property owner's notified, and it's not such a severe level that they typically address that violation in a timely manner, and most of the time it's not repeated. What we have with the hoarding situation is on a whole nother level, where they're violating multiple sections of our code individually, and very difficult to utilize our existing code to adequately address hoarding situations. We've had a couple in the past history here in Raymore, just since I've been here, where we've been able to deal with the problems, but through intervention by a lot of other groups. We really didn't have a great ordinance at that time to tackle that severe of an issue, but we did the best that we could. What we're trying to do here is, we know there's other hoarding situations that exist in our community. Sometimes you can't see it from the street, sometimes you can. That's what we're trying to deal with this kind of this umbrella overall ordinance, because it really covers multiple areas that an individual might need some assistance on, or be in a situation where they've allowed their property to get such a bad state that it's affecting not only themselves, but it's affecting their neighbors. And that's where our real concern comes in, is where we want to help the individual that has perhaps the mental illness that is causing this situation to occur, but we have to help the other residents that live in the neighborhood. I mean, they're beyond their end and trying to address, and help their neighbors, and they need the local government to step up to the plate to try to address the situation. We've been in contact with other organizations, in the preparation of this ordinance, dealing through, county health, through the state mental health organizations, the fire district. There's a lot of different partners in working on this ordinance and moving forward that will call in if we have the proper tool to even start the dialogue. So we feel that the language that we're proposing here is good language. It's not a common ordinance. And certainly in the metropolitan area, we're going to be kind of leading the charge here on having something on the books. We've looked at other communities, what they have across the country that have been utilizing it, but it's not a lot of local examples, but I don't think that should impede us from trying to, again, put something in place that helps us address the severity of what these issues can create. So again, what we have proposed before you is entirely new language. We tried to listen to your comments from the initial work session. Hopefully the modifications we made make it a little stronger, a little more acceptable for you, but we welcome any other changes that you would suggest. What we'd ask is your support in moving forward with this so we can place it on an agenda for public action. So that's all for staff at this time, sir.
Thank you, Jim.
Jim, did you have anything to add to that at this time?
That concludes all staff reports on this item, sir.
Let's start the discussion. Mr. Kellogg.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and thank you, Mr. Carteret, for the ordinance, all the hard work and that. I do want to ask a question. In the definitions, where definition B on page 4 of 24 of the ordinance, preventing ingress or egress of windows or doors. And then following up with that, down to F, limit the operation of doors. Can you explain to me the intent of B and its difference between B and F? Then I'll give you where I'm going with that next.
Yes, sir. And again, what we're proposing, what B is dealing with is, it's also a public safety issue. So we have to have the ability for public safety personnel to be able to get into the building, to be able to move about the building, and to be able to exit the building as well. So that's what we're dealing with the windows and doors. It becomes a safety hazard if something about your accumulation of material is preventing the ingress or egress. So if you've got boxes of things so stacked up that you can't use any of the windows, you can't get in and out of any of the windows, or the doorways are impeded, that is what B is dealing with. We're proposing to strike out the language at F. I believe council at the work session felt that that was too vague. So what we're proposing with is the B language, simply preventing ingress and egress.
Okay, and that's what I figured you'd tell me, and I don't disagree with it. But the thing that I would ask, would it be prudent, because the way that I interpret, or I think the intent is to not so much, restrict the movement or the ability to open and close an interior door, but the exterior door. And this here does not differentiate or specify that that's the exterior. Okay, now I understand the need or the wishes for us to be able to open and close ingress and outgress for emergency personnel, but also the thing that I think about, and unfortunately I have seen hoarding situations like what you talk about, to the point where they could not close their exterior door, and it invites vermin and wildlife into the interior of the structure. So that's why I asked this question, is that would be a major concern of mine as a citizen, that those doors be able to close to keep, wildlife out. We've got many different areas throughout the city of Raymore that back right up to wooded areas where raccoons, rats, coyotes, unfortunately, that would be able to enter. So I guess that's where I'm at, is should we consider specifying, would it be worthy of specifying that the exterior door is the intent?
Who are we talking to? Are we asking a question of staff? Just open it, okay.
Open it up for food for thought.
Oh, Mr. Moorhead, okay.
I'll just address the question and then make comments later. As a person who has represented one of the most egregious hoarding situations the city has ever had, my client inside his house got to a point where he barricaded himself in to where he could not get to the exterior door by blocking interior doors. So actually, I would actually encourage that we leave it open. Look, if somebody wants to reformat a room where they have one door, like to a closet where they want to permanently leave shut, or a second entryway, and they do that with a purpose, that's not what this is about. This is about the objects of the hoarding inadvertently affecting the normal use of the house. And when the person inside can be too unsafe to even exit their home to get to the exterior door, I think we have to apply both. I don't think it's just an exterior and interior.
Mr. Holmes?
I would concur with Councilmember Moorhead's comments. In addition, if
one's bathroom door is so blocked that they can't get to it, where would they go to use the bathroom? If you cannot get to one's kitchen and public safety officials need to access a gas line or a water line, I think you have the same public safety concerns with the vast majority of the interior doors as you do the exterior doors.
Mr. Berenson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. This is also a section that I highlighted and took some notes today. And at first I kind of thought the same thing that Councilman Kellogg said. And, you know, one of the things I was concerned with, you know, windows. So if I put an armoire in front of my window, am I a hoarder? But, you know, when you read through this, it talks about an accumulation of objects, goods, possessions, and that's just junk stacked up, blocking doors and blocking windows. So after reading it more thoroughly, I agree that it should stay the way that it's presented right now.
Okay. Anyone else? Sonia.
Thank you. I don't have a comment on that question. It sounds like we're ready to move on. I'm just curious, what you said you looked at some ordinances, not locally, but in other places. I'm just curious where else they have these, if you wouldn't mind sharing.
I didn't bring that file with me. I was just looking for it with that question. Do you recall the communities? Houston was one that we know, yeah, that we looked at.
You could email me.
If I could email you, yeah, we have a list of several that we pulled from and that we utilize. I'll get that to you.
Thank you.
And I think Chief may have a few.
We did, as a matter of fact, we did a lot of the research together. Yeah, Houston was probably the biggest jurisdiction. A number of smaller, for some unknown reason, up in Minnesota, there were a number of smaller jurisdictions as well. But you know, certainly, you know, Jim can send you the list. We did a lot of research together on different jurisdictions.
Okay, Mr. Barber.
Thank you. I can kind of remember us, most of this that we marked out, but on the limit the operation of doors, don't we have something in the code now that somebody has to have a front door on their home and windows on their home? You know, you got to be able to seal your home up, and can't we step in? And that's kind of why that, you know, we thought that was too vague, because we were more concerned about the outside, sealing up the outside of the home.
Yes, there are provisions in our existing building code that address operable doors, operable windows, ventilation throughout the home, natural ventilation throughout the home. So there are other standards that would apply to, again, more isolated issues.
Mr. Moorhead.
I would also point out that item B and item H both cover that. I mean, item F is somewhat duplicative. I think that's one of the reasons of the three, it was the one most vague, but we didn't kill it just for vagueness, because you really, by preventing ingress and egress to doors, that limits the operation of doors, and to impede access to gain entry into a building. So I think we knew that it was covering in other ways as well.
Any other questions about this particular ordinance? Mr. Holman.
I have one for staff that may be best addressed to Mr. Zur. I think I know the answer to this, but I'd just like to clarify. This ordinance, first of all, deals more with identifying an individual in need and trying to get help for that person, as opposed to a purely punitive measure such as speeding. You were over the speed limit, you're going to get a fine. Is that a correct assessment?
I think that's some of the hope with the inclusion of Section 920 under the language, though, of course, you do have the ability for enforcement through the municipal court if necessary, and you're not able to receive the resolution necessary to avoid the public danger.
And then again, the second part of my question, this ordinance I would look at, if you were to make a comparison, analogy comparison, it's more like DWI than speeding. Speeding is straightforward. If the speed limit is 40 and you're doing 42, technically you're in violation of that ordinance. It's no fault. It doesn't matter if your speedometer is working or not. You're guilty. This one takes more into account the totality of the circumstances. Someone could have a window that was blocked off because they've got stuff stacked up in their sink, but they don't seem to have any other problems, no other functional problems. They can ingress, egress out of the house. There's no health or safety issues. Obviously, we're not going to deal with that. Is that a correct assessment of how this ordinance is written as well?
I think what you're going to make sure and impress upon the code enforcement officers that are out enforcing this is going to be the definition that's identified under the dangerous accumulation. There is some degree of discretion within those terms. The whole idea of what was going to boil it down to, does it qualify as a safety hazard for the occupant or the building occupant or neighboring property owner? And they're going to have to be taking that into consideration when they're in the field enforcing it.
Mr. Moore. Oh, sorry.
I'd like to build on that because I think Councilman Holman really sums this up. When you look especially in the dangerous accumulation definitions, we've kind of boiled that down to remove things that were much more subjective, like are visibly damaged or broken, things like that. And we're really getting to the heart of things that are public safety, as Chief pointed out. But I'd point out under the unlawful accumulations, the subjectivity. For example, the first three have a public health risk component to that. But even if you get beyond that, there's some subjectivity. For example, in item D, having items in excess of what is reasonable and customary. You know, we have our beer can guy. If he brought those in for a couple of weeks just to catalog them for sale, that's a completely different circumstance. And that's something that codes would have the ability to communicate with the individual. So there is an opportunity to occasionally have a few things and amass a few things. We're not talking about the volume of stuff as the crime. We're talking about the public safety risk is the protection. Number two, I'd point out on item F, you know, having things with a visible state of deterioration. With a wife who's an artist that loves shabby chic and distressed things, people put out stuff all the time in their yards or up in their homes that are rusted or sharp or whatever. But in this particular instance, if you notice previous to that, abandoned, discarded, or unused. So there are criteria there that allow our codes department to be able to subjectively speak to these people. We're not running around telling people they can't have what they have. We're saying just don't do it to where you or other people are going to get hurt. And I think that's accomplished here. And so I'm not trying to shut off conversation, but I would move that this go forward to the council for consideration.
Okay. Mr. Burke.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Question as far as how does a code violation get reported or even become discoverable? Is this going to be people trying to sell each other out and say, oh, I saw in their door when I was selling popcorn? Or is it, what makes it where we're able to actually have the permission to look in the home in the first place?
I'll start. It's really no different than any code violations. So most code violations come in through a complaint from a neighbor because they don't like what's happening next door. They don't want to see what's happening next door. But some code violations are staff initiated as well, just simply driving the streets on a daily basis. Things of this nature, a lot of the hoarding that I described spills out to the outside. That's when it really becomes noticeable, of course. So that's where the neighbors really get frustrated with the conditions. Again, you know, we can handle the individual isolated issues. It's when they accumulate many different things. And what I see with the hoarder is they're going to meet several of the items of unlawful accumulations. But there's other instances when maybe emergency personnel are called to a structure. For whatever reason, they're there, and they may, you know, whether it's fire, police, they may see something on the property or situations. You know, we had a recent one within the last year when that occurred, where for another reason, police were in the house, but alerted us to a completely unrelated violation that existed there. But again, neighbors usually are the ones, especially in a situation like this. These take a long time to occur. You don't get a hoarder just overnight. I mean, some violations just appear overnight, but this type of situation grows over time, and it then becomes extremely difficult to address. And just one more point of clarification on why this is important. What we see with the hoarders a lot of times, it's not about a collection of one item. It's a collection of a lot of different things. So in some of the situations we look at, it's not a violation to have 8 step ladders leading up against your house. It's not a violation to have 12 dog kennels scattered about your backyard, or 5 or 6 patio sets. But when you start getting all those same accumulations on one property, that's where you're starting to get into the true impact on the adjacent property owners. So current code can address those isolated situations. We need a bigger tool, which we think this is, that helps us look at the bigger picture of what's happening on that property. So hopefully that, addressed your question. I don't go way beyond that, but I thought it was just an important statement as to the differences between the hoarding situations and just an isolated violation.
Kevin, did you have something? I know you were.
Yeah, thank you. One of the things that we talked about, and I believe this covers everything, and Chief, I'm going to ask you, is a lot of times the family members, they come to the city or come to the police department, and they're at their wits' end. They can't do anything. So we needed something so the chief wasn't put on the spot and said, throw up their hands and say, I can't do anything. Well, now, hopefully this is what you need.
Absolutely, sir, and thank you, because I actually was raising my finger for that very reason, that many times we are there, as Mr. Carteret indicated, because of a call, for service there, for whatever the reason is, but many times it is a family member that's at their wit's end, because they need to get help for that individual, and they just don't know how to do it, and so, they are looking for those types of resources, be it mental health providers, or, some way in which to get that property cleaned up and get their relative into a safe environment.
Mr. Townsend?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Quick question on, does this, from home-based businesses, does this exclude them from unintentionally being captured into this ordinance?
It would not exclude them, but just what it would do, they would have, I would think, they would have organized accumulations of materials. They would have, for products, if they're keeping products at their home. I think that would be the difference. Only when it becomes a dangerous accumulation would it create a situation. So I don't think a home-based business is necessarily excluded from.
Thank you.
From the ordinance.
Well, there's nothing else. I know that you motioned to move forward with this and have it placed on our agenda, but I'll look for a consensus here. If everybody's good, we'll move forward with it. Okay. Thank you, sir. Next item is item B on the agenda, which is the ordinance for cars parked in residential lots. Mr. Fairborn.
Mr. Carteret. Thank you, sir. A second item that was on the agenda, work session back on August 7th, was a proposal that was presented by Councilmember Moorhead at that time. And the request was to look at restricting the number of vehicles that can be parked on a residential lot. The focus is now upon properties that are zoned single-family R1 and are under 1 acre in size. What staff looked at, again, based upon the discussion that occurred at the work session, was to prepare a draft ordinance, which we have done. Again, we're dealing with the property maintenance code, and we're dealing with the section 545-431. What we're looking at here, this is existing language in our code. So what we've done with the highlight and the cross out is what we propose to amend our existing language. So what we have are 3 changes we would propose. The first one would be under the definition of vehicle, where we're simply, for clarification, adding the term motorcycle. So motorcycles would be counted in the maximum number of vehicles, along with the other, car, truck, campers, et cetera, on the restrictions on number of vehicles. The second change we're proposing, with subsections A, H, I, and J of the existing language, we're just deleting some repetitive language where we've defined the term vehicles. We don't need to use the language including cars, trucks, et cetera. So we're just getting rid of repetitive language with the second proposed change. The third proposed change would be adding the subsection K. So this is the meat of the request this evening. And it specifically would read that on properties of less than 1 acre in size in the R1 or PUD zoning district, no more than 8 vehicles shall be parked or stored outside on their property. Staff is simply proposing to add the PUD language because many of our, not many, but several of our larger subdivisions, Creekmore is zoned PUD, Alexander Creek, Ramblewood, those are the 3 major single family, the typically R1, but for other reasons, they've been zoned PUD. We wanted to make sure those subdivisions were covered. So that's the only change that we proposed to the language that Councilmember Moorhead presented. That's what we have proposed for you this evening under the restriction of number of vehicles parked on a residential lot.
Thank you.
Concludes staff.
Anything else to add, Mr. Fearborn, at this time?
That concludes staff report on this item, sir.
Discussion? Mr. Burke.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Well, maybe I need to ask a question about code first. Is there a code that talks about the number of people that can reside in a house and based on how many bedrooms? And because my follow-up question would be, if they're all drivers, why can't they all own a vehicle? And if they have licensed and they're in working order and they have driveway space in a large home, why couldn't they have boats and motorcycles and other things that people enjoyed?
The answer to the initial question, there are limitations regarding how many individuals can occupy a home, but typically the standard definition is a family. So we don't, by that standard definition, we don't limit the number of related individuals that can be in a home. We have a lot of multi-generational homes. So the only specific numbers attached to that are unrelated individuals, which we don't have a lot of that in Raymore. If we're in a college town, it becomes a big issue. We talk about 4 unrelated individuals in a home. That really doesn't come to play into Raymore. The numbers are strictly based upon building codes. We have to talk about number of bedrooms, et cetera. So there's not a specific standard for that. There are limitations, though, on when we talk about parking of vehicles, there are limitations on how much of your lot can be covered with impervious surface, and vehicles have to be parked on impervious surfaces. So there's limiting factors already in play. So you can't have today you can't have an unlimited number of vehicles on your property. This is, again, somewhat tied into other issues that we've talked about, where we're trying to just place a what would be considered a normal limit on vehicles on a lot.
Anyone else? Mr. Abdel-Gawad.
So just for my clarification, this is suggesting that even if I have enough space in my driveway to have more than 8 cars, I can't have more than 8 cars.
Again, parked for a long period of time. We're not talking about a special event or anything of that nature. We're talking long-term continuous parking of vehicles. Yes, it would be limited to 8.
Mr. Kellogg.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Operable, licensed, tagged, or inoperable?
All vehicles on private property have to be operable unless they're inside of a enclosed structure.
Inside of a closed structure.
Mr. Moorhead.
When I first was looking at this, that's why I stressed the criteria R1 for single family. Again, the odds of somebody having 8 adults is relatively limited, not impossible. But in addition, under 1 acre. And by doing so, especially as I went around all 4 wards, I was unable to find a driveway that could properly hold 8. Most won't. Now, if you park in the garage, but there are very few that even come close. I mean, you'd have to wedge them in and count motorcycles, but it's very difficult. This would not actually apply to almost the entire city. Again, for R1, under 1 acre.
Yeah, because it wouldn't apply to R1E, which
That's
are our
correct.
state lots.
Any of the others, RE, rural residential, what we call our farmettes, any of those. And Silver Lake has a number of driveways that wrap around the back, and they get close. But the idea is 8 cars is unheard of.
If I could fit the entire council's cars that you drove here tonight in my driveway. And there are 2 or 3 neighbors could do the same.
Sonia?
And I agree. There are a few houses in our neighborhood as well that are not on an acre lot that have a couple of driveways and I believe could fit 8. And as I stated before when we talked about this, I feel like because we have other places in the code that say that vehicles have to be operable and they have to be licensed and they can't block the sidewalk, I feel like we have enough other safety nets to prevent this and to be able to enforce that we really don't need to say people can only have 8 vehicles, because I think if someone has enough driveway space and they follow all those other guidelines, then who are we to tell them? I mean, especially motorcycles. There are lots of driveways that could hold 8 motorcycles, and if my family wants to drive motorcycles, how can we say that I can't have 8 motorcycles?
Anyone else? Are you counting votes or are you counting cars?
I'm counting my vehicles. I've got
Okay.
7 right now. Yeah, I've got 2 weight runners. They're not there anymore. They were on a trailer on my driveway.
I'm hearing a little bit of a split on this, but I'll kind of take a straw poll here. Who wants to move forward with the ordinance? It kind of looks like it's not going to move forward. So, Mr. Burke.
I would be willing to go okay with 10, but I know that sounds crazy, but I just feel like we're limiting people's ability to go after their pursuit of happiness and play in Raymore. I mean, you could have a camper and a boat and a motorcycle and a sports car and a truck and a van to do all different things. And that could be a family of, my family has 5. If I had a couple more children, there'd be a lot of drivers in that house for 3 or 4 years, but not forever.
Mr. Cataret, just as a question, just like we asked with the hoarding ordinance, are there other model ordinances that fall under this particular purview that were the restriction?
I think we're entering new territory with this specific language. I haven't come across it. Doesn't mean it's not out there, but I haven't come across it. But we didn't go out and do a lot of research on this specific topic either. So we certainly could.
Okay. Ms. O'Dell, go ahead.
Mr. Burke's question kind of goes back to his statement goes back to my question. Why do we need to pick a number? If all of the vehicles are legal, if none of them are blocking the sidewalk, if they're parked legally based on Section A, then why do we need to say there's a magic number of vehicles a person in Raymore can have?
Mr. Moorhead.
Well, first of all, it goes back to Mr. Cataret's foundation that you'd have to have people that live in the house that drive. And I understand that out of 20,000 people, we're going to find a unique circumstance. That's the purpose of the limitation with the R1 under 1 acre. Now, when I spoke to the Planning and Zoning Commission a year ago, my remark was, you pick the number. The problem is we have had a hoarding situation with problems with cars, but because of them being parked under our existing code, the codes people can't go look to see if they're licensed and tagged. And so the problem is we do have a problem. Just not a grand problem, but here's our dilemma. With everything we look at, we can find an exception, one exception. The reality here, though, is we don't have many families with 8 eligible drivers in one single family with 8 or more cars on property. Now, we do here locally, in Ward 2, matter of fact, have one with over 17, with one guy living in the house. None of them tagged, but we can't go fix it. So the problem is this is a throwing the baby out with the bathwater. If people want to find a problem with this, find it. 8, 10, it's subjective. The problem is we have an issue with people hoarding cars, hoarding vehicles, clogging up areas. It's an issue to address.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I've seen the house that Councilman Moorhead has talked about, and I agree. Something needs to be done to fix that. And I've gone back and forth on this too. it's tough for me to support a number. It's tough for me to restrict people from having licensed vehicles in their driveway. So my question is to Mr. Carteret, is there anything else we can do? Let's take the specific example that Councilman Moorhead cited. Is there anything else that we can change in the code to help fix this issue and a few other issues in town without limiting the number of vehicles?
It's a very isolated problem in that, this ordinance is not going to apply to very many properties within the city. But it is necessary when you have the extreme. And with any code, that's why we have code, because we have individuals that push what's reasonable, go to the extreme level. That's why we have to have these codes in place. To say that this is a code that we will utilize on a daily, weekly, monthly basis, it's not going to happen. But it's good to have in place when you have the extreme. It's not as if we're going to be driving up and down the streets and counting how many vehicles are in driveways. We're just not going to do that. But I could give a couple examples of extreme situations where they're legally parked, they're operable, they just have an excessive number. And eight's just a number. It could be anything. But when I talk excessive, we're getting to the higher end of it, where they just have an accumulation of vehicles. They may not have other violations that exist, but they have an accumulation of vehicles. That presents, it's just, for neighbors, it's an unattractive situation.
I've seen two other situations in town that are approaching the 8 vehicles plus also. So I know of 3 that I've seen that this could affect. One of the issues also is that are we not able to look at what's in their backyard, or aren't there issues with that as well?
From a code enforcement standpoint, no, we're not able to simply walk around somebody's property. We can take the normal path to the front door, as anybody can, and we can observe from right-of-ways. And on occasion, we can observe a neighbor would allow us onto their property. So we can go on their property, because they've invited us, to look upon another property. But we can't just walk in someone's backyard to...
That was the point I'd hope you would make there. So can we go to a neighbor and ask for permission to go on their property to view somebody else's backyard?
Typically, the neighbor will offer that, because that would be our comment. Because often we can't see behind a privacy fence, or we can't see what's happening in the back. But the neighbor will, on almost every instance, if they're concerned, they'll say, please, come to my property, I'll show you.
All right, well, thank you. I would support anything that would help resolve this in lieu of putting a number on the cars. Thank you.
Not really heard any numbers change here, but if those who did raise their hand wish to place it on the agenda and see where it goes, we can do that. Do you wish to do that?
I'd like it on the agenda.
All right, sir. We'll move that forward then. Item C, adopt private infrastructure policy. Mr. Fearborn.
Thank you, sir. I would ask Mr. Carteret. It's planning and zoning and development night.
If you're not tired of me yet, you will be. Any previous work session, multiple work sessions, councils had discussion regarding the acceptance of private infrastructure. We've talked about it with the Herald Estates residents regarding their lift station. We've talked about it with Morningby residents about their private streets. But it's come up in other various discussions of establishing a policy and a procedure that can be followed when a private entity, a property owners association, a homeowners association approaches the city to discuss the city taking over or accepting those private improvements and assuming the future maintenance responsibility of those improvements. So at the most recent work session where council discussed this, you asked for us to develop a policy regarding the city acceptance of private infrastructure. So we put together this short 3-page policy. I'll briefly go through it, then provide a couple of comments. We do need to specifically define infrastructure for the purposes of this policy, as well as what would be private infrastructure. The infrastructure that we're talking about could be streets, it could be water lines, sanitary sewer lines, storm sewer lines, it could be lift stations, street lights, et cetera. All those categories all define what infrastructure is. Private infrastructure certainly is just defined as any infrastructure that's owned and maintained by a private entity, like I talked about, a homeowners association or a property owners association. So what we developed is a four-step process that an entity would take to get the issue in front of City Council for determination. We've defined, for that process, we've defined qualifying factors that we would utilize for each of the categories that I talked about. So for example, for streets, we would first need to look at what the condition of the pavement would be. And that would be an analysis just like we do of all the city streets, where we have the engineers, the public work officials go out and actually make an analysis of pavement condition. The same with curb conditions. So those would be the first things that we would look at to see if the infrastructure meets those qualifying factors. And we do that for all the categories that I outlined, the storm sewers, sanitary sewers, et cetera. We then need to define, after we do that determination of the qualifying factors, we need to determine if there's any deficiencies that do exist. And what we do with those deficiencies is really in the hands of the council. First, if there were deficiencies, we would note those to the private entity that they need to be corrected. If they're not as simple as correcting the deficiency, then we want to work with the entity and coming up with a work plan. Well, how do we get to meeting those deficiencies? So that work plan would be developed between city staff and the private entity on what exactly needs to be done to meet those qualifying factors for whatever, again, which category we're dealing with. That work plan can then be submitted to the council for your determination on timing of when those deficiencies would be corrected, et cetera. It at least identifies what the issues are and gets it in front of you for discussion purposes. And then the final part of the policy deals with the factors for council consideration. So looking at what things are you going to look at when that private entity comes to you, and especially under the cases of the work plan. If there's specific items that need to be resolved, let's weigh those against what the factors that council would use in making the determination are to see if it is prudent for the city to accept the infrastructure, especially if it's accepting it under a work plan. So this was the policy, again, going off of discussion you had at your last work session. Mr. Crass and I worked on putting this together and are open to any questions you may have on the policy. That concludes staff report.
Thank you, Jim. Mr. Holman.
Thanks, sir. Hadn't even raised my hand yet. You're reading my mind. Really no questions, but thank you both very much. I think this is exceptional work. I saw about 3 of my sentences down here, and you even cleaned those up. This is really what I was hoping for, was to kind of flesh out a policy for us as we see more and more requests coming forward. And we've had a number, I guess, back past the last 12 months or so with the cemetery and the lift station and a couple of others, and a couple that we had to take over, like the some of the subdivision signs that had no ownership and they were falling into deterioration. I think this is really good because this will occur from time to time. It may come at us in short bursts, but I think for us to have a policy that we can point to, a good starting point for staff that's outlined and approved by the council, will not only benefit us, but councils in the future as these questions come before them. So again, thank you both very much. I think this is great work.
Anyone else? Ms. Abdelgawad.
I have a question. So you were talking through it and I got a little confused, I think. So you talked about the work plan, and so I see under deficiencies, it talks about the work plan. But I was trying to follow through in the steps 1, 2, 3, 4. Does the work plan kind of fit as part of step 2? Can you help me understand? Is it separate from the steps, or does it fit under step 2 or step 3?
It really fits under step 3. So when we're going through, we're doing our evaluation on what action needs to be done, and perhaps all of those qualifying factors are met. So that it's a simple proceed with the resolution. But during that step is when staff would identify if there are any deficiencies. And again, our initial comments to the private entity would be these deficiencies need to be corrected. It then may lead, depending upon the severity, cost involved of those deficiencies, they may come up with, what about a work plan? What if we came up with this over a period of time? We would want to work with them to prepare that work plan to get it in front of council. So for maybe some more immediate action where we could assume, this would be one thing that you could assume maintenance responsibilities while the work plan works its way through. All up for discussion with the council, but that all falls within that step 3 before we bring any action to the council.
Mr. Moorhead.
I've got a little bit of a concern on qualifying factors under streets number 3. The problem is in many of these accepting private infrastructure, we're accepting things that have aged. We're not accepting brand new properties typically. And the problem is most streets and sidewalks did not require ADA ramps at the time. My concern here is, especially in older parts of towns with older sidewalks, are we placing a burden that at the time that the sidewalks went in, ADA ramps were not required, but at this point, now we're making the property owner have to pay for a bunch of ADA ramps or people that own those properties just to get it to qualify. And that's an individual homeowner burden that I'm not sure is reflected here. Could you explain that a little further?
Well, and okay, thank you.
I think regardless, someone is going to have to do it. There are, federal law requires at any time you're doing any maintenance on a street, and the words that have come down is even if you're painting the street is some of the extreme decisions that have come down, you have to bring the ADA ramps into compliance. So it's whether it's with the sidewalks or we're contemplating here that there would be some street work, whether it be an overlay or a microsurface or something like that, that triggers the need to go beyond the street and make sure it complies with the Americans with Disabilities Act for that.
Go ahead, sir.
And I'll come back with this, but if the homeowner put in a valid sidewalk under the laws at that time, if the city is coming in to do this work, it's actually the city's cost. Why should the homeowner bear that cost as a qualifying factor?
What we're looking at is setting a standard that the infrastructure needs to be brought to before we will accept it.
I think we're confusing two things here. Nothing in here says that they're paying for it, sir.
That's what I wanted to clarify.
Yeah.
Because I was concerned in that particular instance, it was the city who wants to do the repair. The city should pay for the ADA ramp, not the private homeowner. But I wasn't sure, it doesn't necessarily, since we're talking about accepting private infrastructure, it implies that it is a private qualification. Therefore, the private homeowner would be better responsible. And I would hope that that could be better clarified.
Yeah,
we haven't had a request yet that they haven't asked us to pay for part of it, sir.
Fair enough.
From any one of the 3 requests that are floating out there.
Jay, did you have anything additional?
Just, I think, kind of a follow-up to Mr. Fearborn's comment. The way I read it, it really still leaves the matter of if we want you to pay half or we want you to pay 15%, still pretty much in free form among the decision of this council. This just kind of lays out the mechanical concepts, if you will. Is that would you say that's correct, Mr. Kras?
Mr. Burke.
I want to give a huge compliment here. This, I think, is well thought out. I ran several scenarios in my head of different possibilities, and it lays it out so people know, groups will know what to expect when they think about going into something like this. I think this is great.
Mr. Moorhead.
I'm in support of this too, but I'm just picking on the fact that this is a pre-qualifying factor. If this doesn't get met, it doesn't get to the level you're talking about. They're excluded. So that's why I'm asking for clarification, because it says the following factors shall be met for the city to accept. Well, if the private homeowner goes, I'm not going to put in an ADA ramp because I didn't have to, it's not up for negotiation. The city has the ability to just go, I deny the application because it didn't meet the qualification. That's why I'm asking for clarification. I would like it to be what we're talking about. I'm just fearful that this is enough of a loophole that we need to be mindful of it.
Mr. Barber.
When I looked at that, and maybe I'm wrong, but I viewed that as this whole thing is negotiable. And to me, I looked at that as another negotiating chip as far as the city has in setting the negotiation for taking on the private infrastructure. That's one of the things that you have to do. Whether we pay for it or they pay for it, it allows us to negotiate.
I do see what he's saying, though, because it says the following factors shall be met for the city to accept ownership and maintenance responsibility of private infrastructure.
Yeah,
so
and negotiation would be may. And that's why, because this is a preceding step, I would hope that we could clarify so that could be achieved.
Well, we can change it to May. My worry is we're not, unless there's ADA ramps there, we're not going to take over the maintenance of it. It would be unlawful for us to take over the maintenance of it. Who puts them in is the negotiation of the money. But we can change it to May if that's the council's.
And that's what I'm asking for clarification, because this reads it's an absolute. It shall. You are disqualified. You don't meet it. And it doesn't say it's up for negotiation.
Sonia, yeah, I saw your hand up a second ago.
I was just going to say that's kind of what I was asking about the work plan, and it sounded like the work plan is as part of either step 2 or step 3, then you work together with them to come to an agreement on how those factors are going to be met. So you have an agreement about how to meet the factors somewhere in step 2 and 3.
Then maybe the following factors may be not met or even achieved, but agreed upon. There you go. Thank you.
Yes. And that's what I'm asking for, is a qualifier there to just merely point that out.
Sure. Mr. Holman?
I think Ms. Abdelgawad hit on it. To me, I read that your concern, a valid one certainly, that the homeowner gets stuck with a bill for an ADA ramp, but to me, that is addressed in the deficiency either corrected. We tell someone, for example, yeah, we'll take this over, we think it would cost $250,000, and they unlikely put out a check for $250,000 and it gets done, but in most cases they don't have that kind of money, and that comes into B. Or a work plan shall be prepared to allow the entity to do this, at which point then we negotiate what the elements of that work plan are, and that's how I read that. That's why I didn't take the same view that you did, but I certainly do want it clarified. I agree.
Mr. Fearborn, did you have any input on that particular?
We'll make that change, sir.
Okay. Anyone else? Any other issues with that? If not, we'll move forward. Would that be something prepared for a future, or are you going to come back to us at a work session?
This one may, no, we'll make if it's okay with the council, we'll make that one wording change to may be agreed upon, and
then move forward with an ordinance.
We'll move forward with the ordinance.
Yeah, because I think
this one would be a resolution because it's just a procedure.
Oh, okay,
of the
that's
council.
right. It is a policy.
The other two will be ordinances. The problem is if we don't get these on for next Monday night, we wait until January.
And we've got a couple of projects out there.
And there are some things running, but because the first two are already prepared ordinances, maybe a little bit easier. Yeah, of course, I can say this, Mr. Carteret's the one who's got to put them together, so get on that.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, it's like we should. Okay, so we're moving forward with that. Next item is development fees, item D. If there's nothing else on C, are we good with that? Okay. Move on to item D, development fees. Mr. Fearborn.
Mr. Carteret.
Thank you, sir. In the summer of this year, Councilmember Berenson had approached the city with a question. He got an inquiry regarding the cost of developing single-family subdivisions within the city of Raymore. A question we've been asked several occasions before. Our response And the delay of getting it in front of council at this point in time was to the time it takes to do the comparison study. So we wanted to be thorough with the study that we conducted, similar to what we, again, have done in the past. So what the staff has worked on the last several months, specifically Mr. Gress, is completing a comparison of fees for new development. So we utilize the 11 cities that standard comparison that we use for the metropolitan area. We also added in at least Summit and Peculiar because they're close to Raymore, and a lot of the developers that work in Raymore work in those communities as well. What we wanted to do was a comparison that looked at, all the actions that were necessary to get a new development, a new residential development to occur in the city. So we went all the way from looking at the application filing fees, and this would be assuming a rezoning needs to take place, preliminary plats, final plats. Then we looked at cost comparisons for actually putting the infrastructure in the ground. So what's it cost to put the water, what's it cost for city fees to install the public improvements, the streets, water, sewer. So infrastructure installation requires plan review fee and a inspection fee where we have our city inspectors look at the work that was completed. The best way to do the comparison was for staff to do a hypothetical subdivision. So we simply picked a subdivision of 35 acres, proposed 65 single-family lots. Again, we went through the rezoning process. We went through preliminary and final plat. Then we assumed what it would cost to do infrastructure on a subdivision this size, approximately $540,000. We needed to have that number so we could start looking at what how the different cities assess their fees. In the staff report itself, we showed you a couple of graphs dealing with the data that we had accumulated as of that time. We've gotten a little bit of additional information since the staff report was submitted to you. So I'm going to go ahead and hand out, we've done a new graph that includes some additional information from 2 communities, as well as the spreadsheet itself. So you can see specifically the breakdown of all the different categories in the process of looking at a development, as well as the specific fees that are charged. One thing to note, a true comparison, and I say this when we do the building permit fees as well, it can be very difficult for staff to go through the process to make an exact apples to apples comparison, because how each community does the filing fees and how they specifically assign the amounts, it does differ community to community, of course. So sometimes it's straightforward, especially with the application fees. It can be a little bit more straightforward. The other factor, and Mr. Gress will talk about this as well, is we used a fairly small subdivision when we looked at the 35 acres, 65 lots. So we also did another analysis with a larger subdivision, because I think that's where the true differences of how we have a set fee. Doesn't matter whether you do 3 lots or 3,000 lots, it's a set fee, where most communities have ranges of fees. We did a set fee many, many years ago and just tried to averaging out the cost. In our opinion, time that it takes for staff to look at application involvement doesn't really change over a much larger subdivision. It really doesn't take twice as much time to review a 100-lot subdivision as it does a 50-lot subdivision, so why charge twice the fee? So our fees, again, are based upon averages that were done. We started that program back in 2007, specifically tracked how much time that staff spends on each application through the process. We actually looked at the salary amounts that the different individuals made looking at the applications to come up with that fee. And that changes over time depending upon which staff members look at it. At this point in time, I think we're very accurate. Mr. Gress does most of the review of the applications. And the fee structure that we analyze each year is still on target to where we need to be. One other comment just on the application fee side of it is that I truly believe, as I look at the other communities, that you get more services for our application fees than what you get in other communities, because there's tasks that we do that other communities don't do as part of the application process. We do it because I think it brings a surety to staff and to the residents that it was done accurately. Notices to the neighbors, legal notice publication, et cetera. All things under our control. We know exactly how the notification was done. There's no question on how it was done. I just think it's better for staff to do that than to leave that to the applicant. So when you look at application fees, that's all included in ours, where it may not be included in some of the other communities. So I think that's also to our advantage that ours is a complete fee, and we try to simplify the process as much as possible for the applicant. I'll call on Mr. Gresh just to briefly go through the spreadsheet I'll hand out, as well as the updated total development fee cost, and then again, we'll be open for any questions.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Carteret did a very good job of kind of a brief overview of where Raymore stands in comparison to some of the other cities in our region. But what I wanted to do here is kind of go through this spreadsheet and just note a couple things that are really important to think about as you start looking at what that total fee is in general and overall in relation to the different fees and the different parts of the application process that get you to that total number of the overall cost of development. And the first thing that's really important to look at, and Mr. Carteret kind of touched on it briefly, is that there's really no one single formula or method that cities use to determine application fees. It's really all over the board, and you'll see that in the spreadsheet. Whereas if you look at Raymore, and you'll see that there's really a flat rate with the exception of our erosion control deposit and emergency siren fee. Those are based on the acreage of the development, but for the most part, most of our fees are a flat rate. So for a preliminary plat, it's $790, regardless of whether you're platting 3 lots or 3,000 lots. It's a flat rate. When you start looking at other communities like Belton or Blue Springs or Lee Summit, the total cost for that development is a function of the size of the development. So a lot of the communities here, you'll see they charge a base fee of $200 to $400, but in addition to that, there's also a $3 to $5 fee per lot within that development. So as Mr. Carteret also mentioned, with the hypothetical development that we chose, this 65 lot development, while that in this instance might be a little more expensive in Raymore than it is in a couple other communities, if you look at larger developments such as Timber Trails or a Good Ranch or Whitetail Run, developments that have 200, 300, or even 400 lots, in other communities, with that amount of lots, that cost really starts to add up. So a plat the size of Timber Trails or Whitetail Run and a Lee Summit might range, upwards of $5,000, or in Belton that would total about $1,400. So as you increase the size of that development, that price is going to go up. Whereas in Raymore, you get that flat fee. It is not a function of how many lots you're platting. It's truly based on the amount of time that takes Mr. Carteret or myself to go through that application and go back and forth with the developer and get that application from the beginning stages up until the end. The other thing that's really important to note, as Mr. Carteret mentioned, is the services that are included in that application. So with a couple of communities, there's again the flat rate that's charged with the application, but in addition to that, there's also publishing fees or legal notice fees that the city charges to cover those costs that they incur throughout the entire process. Whereas those are included in our fee, but those services are also provided by staff. We don't require the applicant to send out those notices or contact their neighbors of their adjoining property. That's all provided in-house by staff. The last thing that you'll notice well, and you'll see it in the revised spreadsheet and the revised graph that you all received tonight, is the different timing of the fees and kind of when they're spread out and who they're applied to. So the one thing that you'll see there in the graph that you were provided with tonight is that in the previous version, Raymore ranked number 3, but in the version you received tonight, we're actually bumped down to number 5. And that's because this afternoon we received a couple more pieces of information from a couple communities in Johnson County. And if you look over on the very far right-hand side of your spreadsheet, you'll see the column that deals with the excise or traffic impact fee. And you'll note that several communities charge that based on a per trip or a per household basis, if you will. Whereas in Raymore, that fee is calculated at the time a building permit is issued for the home, and that's when that fee is collected. With several communities in Johnson County, that fee is actually paid up front by the developer, and it's a direct function, again, of the size of the development. So for Gardner, Kansas, and I believe it was Shawnee, Kansas, it's anywhere between 20 cents and 21.5 cents per square foot of platted area. And again, as you get larger and larger in the development, that fee really adds up, and that's solely the responsibility of the developer up front, albeit they more than likely spread that cost out in the price that they sell that lot for in the end, but that's a huge expense for a developer up front to have to cover. So it's important to know kind of although we do collect those same fees that many communities do, we just kind of go about it in a different way, and we collect them at a different time, and they're more spread out over the development process. And as Mr. Carteret mentioned, this is something we go through every year and kind of evaluate where we stand in a relationship to some other communities, and we'll be going through that process here again shortly, I'm sure. So staff would be more than happy to answer any questions or take any direction from the council as far as items to consider the next time we consider going through this list of development fees for the city of Raymore. And that will conclude staff report.
Thank you, David. Mr. Feuerborn.
Thank you, sir. As both Mr. Carteret and Mr. Gress have indicated, all of these fees are annually reviewed. They are very similar to our water and sewer model with the fees that we come to the council with and have the public hearing on for both of those truly are cost of service. The one that kind of runs outside of that curve is actually one that we're planning on looking at this year, and you'll note it on page 19 of 24 of your packet, and that's the infrastructure inspection fee based on the 35 or the sample, the initial sample development that Mr. Carteret had mentioned to you all. You can see that compared to the metro average, we are high on that one. Before this exercise even began, Mr. Crass and I were discussing the fact that that particular fee on our part is 5% of the total development cost for inspection and 1% for administration. It's the same formula that we use when we are doing our own administration and inspection of a public project. Like if Fox Ridge Drive, if a bridge is going in down there or a culvert's going in down there and we're having to do that inspection, that's something we actually charge ourselves to be doing. But relative to these private developments, this is the one that stood out to us the most over the course of the summer. So we're actually doing a man-hour cost of service review on this particular item to see if we can get that price down to the metro average. It's not a large revenue item for us last year, or last year we are currently projecting through the auditors group about $48,000 for this particular one. But when you look at it from the standpoint of an individual development going in, especially if it's a smaller one, obviously, that there's still a lot of costs for, it does stand out. So we want to be sure that we conduct a review of that one just the same way that all of the rest of them are. That does conclude staff reports.
Mr. Berenson.
I'd like to thank Mr. Carteret and the entire staff. This is a lot more comprehensive than what I was expecting. My rationale here was twofold. I wanted just to merely ask a question to see, are our fees hindering development? Are they so expensive that they're hindering development? And obviously by this, they're not. And second, are they in line with everybody else? Are we generating the appropriate revenue, which it looks like we are? So again, thank you for all the hard work on this. I have no complaints here at all, and it looks like we're in line with all the other fast-growing cities. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, guys. Appreciate the work on that. Anybody else have anything? Mr. Holman.
Just a question. This refers to our fees, and it may be an apples to orange comparison because typically, at least in the early items we're talking about here, we're talking about an individual who owns or has purchased a large tract of land to subdivide into smaller plats for people to build homes. And he may offer to build the homes, or he may have a set number of builders that build within that, and then those builders incur costs as they build each home. I remember when my home was built 15 years ago, and that's some time ago, but my builder's strong complaint was not that the city's fees or inspections were unreasonable. It was that South Metro's fees and inspections were unreasonable. And we suffer from the fact that we don't maintain or own our own fire department. We're part of a fire protection district. He complained to the point that he had never seen anything like that. He didn't know if he would come back for that reason. So I don't know if that's had an impact on this or not, and there's little that we can do. Obviously, we don't control that entity, but I was curious if you felt that was a factor here.
It's actually changed. There was state law that came into play where the fire districts are not able to charge these inspection fees for single-family, two-family homes anymore. So that fee has been eliminated for several years now.
Interesting. Anyone else? Thanks again for the information. And we'll move on to item E, view of retail strategies. Or did we miss D? No, we're on to E. Go ahead, Mr. Fremont.
Thank you, sir. At last week's council meeting, Councilmember Townsend had asked for an update on where we're at with retail strategies. And as you can see from your packet, that kind of tells you where we're at with the retail strategies. I had actually been speaking with Councilmember Townsend. He's asked a number of questions within the ward meetings, so perhaps I gave him a little bit of an early hint that you all may be seeing this particular letter. We had intended on updating you at the next work session after we pass the December 12th actual hard deadline for this. The short form of this, and we got great work from this group for the first year. Anything they can do, Matt can do better, to quote a song. And he can do it for Raymore rather than the nation. And so, in good conscience, and seeing the work that Matt has done using the information that this group gave us in their first year, we are making great strides. And the outlay amount was simply more than I could bear. And in a lot of discussions with Matt, knowing what he could do, what he has already done, and the strides that he has taken with the information that we now have in our pocket, I went ahead and instructed Matt to write the letter that you see in your packet, made sure that they knew it was coming from myself. You'll notice it's a co-signed situation. Would like to, the council had a long discussion during budget time and actually placed roughly this same amount into the restricted revenue fund out of fund balance to begin the shift from what retail strategies has given us to actually site planning now. And so it is more than likely going to be my recommendation to you all that that amount be held and that we use the budgeted amount that we have proposed or had in the budget under professional services, that amount now be used to begin developing our site plans. That was going to be my comment to you all until about 3 weeks ago. And Mr. Gress has been working with Mr. Tapp, and it turns out that we once again have some incredible internal talent. I will be sharing with you all very, very shortly their first, what they considered to be an amateur effort at site planning, and it has turned out to be a pretty phenomenal plan for something that's been done internally. So I saved the money where we can, And these guys did an incredible job on the North Cass Industrial Park and retail area site plan. And so we will be sharing that with you all and explaining the detail that goes into something like that we were able to do internally. I don't want to rule out the fact that we may still be going for outside expertise in this area, but I think we can use the funding that we had for retail strategies and devote it into the next step and let Matt run with the ball that he now has, that he's doing a very, very good job with. That concludes staff report on this item, sir.
Okay. Any questions? Matt, do you have anything to add to that? No? No, that's
No,
said.
no,
Okay,
sir.
yes. All right. Anyone? Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Mr. Fairborn. At our ward meeting, I did have a couple of questions and requested some executive summaries on a couple of things within the city and how we were working with external agencies and our own internal business and retention surveys and how those were working for us. During this whole contract and was curious to know how that was progressing for us and our savings, that knowing that the staff we had was obviously has proven itself more than capable to do certain things, and we're reaping from those benefits. And I appreciate you indulging, adding this to the work session tonight, not to belabor it anymore this evening, but I'm encouraged to hear that we have gained even more assets internal to the staff that can do some things, and hopefully we can expand that beyond just that one location, consider other locations as well, as far as some conceptual site plans that we can also, with that. I had one question. Are those considered internal, or are those some conceptual designs that can be made public at some point down the future to kind of show the future of Raymore?
I will be sharing those with you all in ward meetings. The one that I have is stamped in 3 different locations confidential, so I assume that we probably won't be sharing it yet. There is a pretty large group that this particular one is probably going to be in front of shortly, though.
I would expect so. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Mr. Holman.
I would just want to say, and I think most of my colleagues feel the same way. I know Councilmember Barber does. We've had this discussion many times. Economic development is something that is certainly very important to this group as well as all members of the city. We see routinely in our citizen surveys and our community conversations. It's also one of those things that's kind of like putting the pea underneath the cups. You can't always divulge what's going on because of the people that make us sign those agreements for non-disclosure. So you know things that we can't know for at least a while. Sometimes we know things that people won't know for a little bit yet. I have great confidence in you. I think that the work that you have done, both with the new development at the former Dean Farm, now the Raymore Marketplace, turned out very well. I think you've added a new level to interaction with this group in your education with us. The tour that you took us on and showing us the various economic development zones was very helpful to me indeed. The only thing that I would ask and put out on the table, and I think this was Councilmember Barber's intent when he brought this up during budget discussions, if there is ever anything that this group, at least from my standpoint, that we can add to that effort, to aid that effort and expedite what you're trying to do as far as resources, money, please bring that to us, because we want to be as much help as we can in the efforts that you're partaking, Matt.
Mr. Fairborn.
One of the things that I know this probably gets old to you all, but it really is invaluable to staff when you all are out cheerleading for the city, which you do so great, and bring us back contacts and bring us back cards. Those it sounds corny, and that is boots on the ground. You're out there too. You see it. If it's attractive to you, it's going to be attractive to us, and I guarantee you we follow up on every single one of those, because it's not always going to be the developer going down. Someday it's going to be somebody coming up to a developer and going, I've heard about this and I want to work with you to get me in there. And it's not always the big fish that can push something like that. So.
Okay, thank you. That's all on our agenda items. There is the other. Does anybody else have anything to bring up tonight? Do we have any reason to go into executive session?
We do not, sir.
All right, then we're adjourned. Thank you. Oh, sure.